A lot of people had already assumed that there would have to be a second shot in the form of a booster. Do you have any issue with the rollout at the moment as it stands?
I think the Australian government's decisions on the rollout have been completely justified in the past week. There's been a lot of criticism that why aren't we going as fast as other countries? Why aren't we already putting needles into people? Why are we waiting? Well, I think in the past week, the look before you leap approach has been vindicated. We've seen concerns about the Pfizer vaccine in Norway, with 30 elderly people apparently having died after receiving the vaccine. And of course, there's been concerns about the AstraZeneca vaccine's efficiency. Now, I'm not jumping at shadows at either of those events, but it does actually confirm why it's important to take this step by step, especially in a country like Australia where we don't face the imminent risks of the UK or the US or many other countries. We're in a lucky position to do this properly, get it right the first time. Now, in terms of double shots and those things, look, I don't know, but what I do know is we've done very well as a nation by looking at things calmly, working in lockstep with the health advice, and that's the strategy we should continue to pursue.
The authorities in Norway are yet to establish a link between the vaccine and also those deaths. They're even going on to suggest that they're not linked at all. But regardless of that, aside from that, it's still going to shake people's confidence, isn't it? Especially those in the elderly aged bracket. Do you see that happening?
Well, look, I think people will eventually take all the evidence in train. As I say, I'm not jumping at shadows at this particular incident. Of course, it needs to be looked at. But there are millions of people across the world that have now received the vaccine, and we haven't heard any similar reports or even significant side effects I haven't seen reports of. So this is perhaps not directly linked, as some are suggesting, but let's look at it properly. We've got the time to do that. I think most Australians will get the vaccine. I just think we need to be calm and reasonable about this. Not every Australian will. Some will not want to for their own health reasons or what have you. But I think we're going to have more than enough Australians put their hand up to do it, so that we reach the so-called herd immunity.
Brendan Murphy provided some commentary yesterday on international travel. He basically ruled it out this year, said it's unlikely to resume before next year. That's obviously going to have some pretty serious flow-on effects, particularly for those industries that have already been battered, i.e. tourism, especially in your state of Queensland. What sort of extra help do you think is going to be needed beyond JobKeeper, which, as we know, ends in March?
Look, I think it's going to be any extra help's going to be very targeted. Because it's not true to say, for example, that the whole tourism industry is suffering at the moment. They've had a terrible year, and
most of it has,
the tourism sector went through really tough circumstances. But no, large parts of the tourism industry are doing really well because people are holidaying here. In my area here, in the Capricorn Coast, all our hotels have been full for months. Now we don't face the international exposure that cities like Cairns do. So what I think is any further assistance has got to be extremely targeted to those subsectors, really, that might be facing significant pain given their special exposure to things like international travel.
Yeah.
That's what's got to be the focus, because we can't keep spending billions of dollars a month, racking up massive amounts of debt. You know, a debt at the moment at $1 trillion would reach a third of the way to the moon if you lay a dollar on top of each other. I don't want to get all the way to the moon. So we've got to make sure any further assistance is affordable and targeted on those that are still feeling the pain.
I mean, we are spending it, that is true, but we're not spending as much. So some figures that have been published today suggest that, let's say tourists from China, they would come to Australia, they'd spend on average about $8,000, but when and that's per person. But when Australians travel within Australia, we only, on average, spend about $2,000 per person. So there is a huge discrepancy there. So in that sense, much more help is going to be needed.
Well, I don't think those figures tell the whole story. That's per person. But in total, we're actually a net importer of tourism, if you like. So in total, this is the figures before COVID, I think from memory the figures were that we spent around $3 to $4 billion a year more overseas as Australians than overseas people spent here on tourism. Now, as I say, that's not per person, that's in total, in aggregate. Now, in theory, if Australians spend the same amount on holidays as they did pre-COVID, but just did it in Australia, there would actually be a net boost to the tourism industry in Australia from that. Now, that's in theory. Obviously, in practice, people have changed their decisions. They're not necessarily spending as much on holidays in total, in aggregate. You're right, probably, I think, per person, there would be a lower spend because when you travel overseas, you know, when the few times I've been overseas, you tend to think this is your budget for spending, and you think, well, I'm only going to be here once, so I might
go on that
extra jet boat. And suddenly the budget goes out the window.
Yeah.
So that per person, you're right. But in aggregate, there is a lot of money still being spent in Australia on tourism. I'm not minimising, though, as I say, those parts of the tourism sector that are especially focused on international travel, they can't just replace that with domestic travellers.
Hey, I was talking to your colleague David Littleproud yesterday. He had a right crack at the tennis players out of Melbourne. The saga is continuing today. Now there's some suggestions that some of the players, they don't want to play the full 5 sets. If it gets to that, they want to restrict it to 3 sets. They believe it's too much. It's unfair because they're in quarantine for 2 weeks. They're not going to be as fit. Have you got anything to say about that?
Mate, I don't know. It doesn't really intrigue me all that much. It seems to me the COVID equivalent of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, some kind of reality show. I never watched an episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, so I haven't followed this all that closely. Look, I suppose these guys are elite athletes, so you know I can somewhat sympathise with their dietary requirements and exercise requirements. I'm certainly not at that elite level. I'd love the tennis to go ahead. But I think, you know, we've got to dial down the outrage on both sides of this. I'm sure probably from the tennis players, there's a few making a few noises. There's probably a few legitimate issues that can be ironed out. At the same time, you know, I think there's bigger things to worry about in the world than getting outraged about some pampered tennis players.
Okay, just finally, the Americans aren't too keen on Josh Frydenberg's stance on his code of conduct when it comes to the big tech companies in the US. The US want it to be not as serious. They want us to kind of dial back, speaking of dialing back the rhetoric, they want us to certainly dial back the rhetoric on that. Have you got a view on that? Josh Frydenberg's already said he's not going to change anything, but the fact that the US government is getting involved, does that change your view at all?
Well, look, it doesn't surprise me the US government is taking this position. It's fairly common for the US government to defend the interests of intellectual property owners, be it Disney, be it pharmaceutical companies, or in this case now new big tech companies. That's always the US government's position in international negotiations, in trade and investment agreements. But we should make decisions which are in the best interests of Australia. And just as we're not going to change policies because of threats and bullying from China, now, there's no threats of bullying here from America. They're free to express their position to us through a public submission process, but we should only look at those arguments on their substantive merits, not because they're being made by the US government. Now, I do think it's right and proper that if a company is going to benefit from the distribution of another product or service, there should be an appropriate compensation for that. When you listen to a song on the radio, the artist or the copyright holder of that song gets paid for that. Because the radio station's benefiting from that, and if big tech are benefiting from distributing your news services, Peter, or newspapers services, they should have to pay compensation for that.